my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you. I was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my tomb till I met you. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul. Now your freedom is all that I know. The old made new, Jesus, when I met you, when you called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy, but chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan, now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing, now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you call my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day.
Let me tell you why you are here. You're here to be salt, the seasoning that brings out the God flavors in this earth. And if you lose your saltiness, how will people ever taste godliness? Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colors in this world. And God is not a secret to be kept. No, we're going public with this, as public as a city on a hill. I'm putting you on a light stand, on full display. And now that you are put on a hilltop, put on a light stand, shine. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God.
We've been
started having some special guests with us, and we've been calling them heroes. And for us at Suncrest, heroes are people who answer a crazy big call to start new churches. And this is my friend Chad. Chad in 2017 started a new church in Avon, Indiana, and he is here this weekend to share a super profound message with us. So I need all of your help in giving Chad the warmest Suncrest welcome we all can. You ready? Ready, set, go.
Well, hello, Suncrest. What an absolute honor it is to be with you. I truly, truly mean that. I'm excited to share with you. It has been an absolute joy as a church planner to partner with Suncrest. We love your leaders. We love your church. In fact, Pastor Greg was one of the first people to call me and say, hey, whatever you guys are doing in the Indianapolis area, we want to get in on it, and we're going to be supporting you. And you are faithful supporters every step of the way. In fact, I think, if I remember back correctly, it's been about 5 years or so, but we had people from Suncrest down there visiting with us the first couple of Sundays when we launched 5 years ago. And ever since the beginning, our mission was really simple. It was to echo God's love across our city and to the nations. In other words, we wanted to maximize your investment in us. And so just a little bit of what God has been doing, kind of in a snapshot over the past 5 years. We have seen nearly 600 people place their faith in Jesus. We have been partnering with local missions to help those that are hurting and homeless and hungry in the Indianapolis area. We've been partnering with global missions in various ways with strategic partners on 5 different continents. And one of the things I love the most is we took your investment in us, just one church plant, and we partnered with other networks. And over 5 years, we partnered with over 400 brand new church plants through your investment in us. And so can you just join me for just a moment in just celebrating the generosity here at Suncrest? I mean it. Come on, put your hands together, make a little bit of noise. We truly, truly, truly love you guys. We truly love you guys. I've been bragging about you in the Indianapolis area for years. So what a joy that I actually get to be here in person and tell you how much we love and appreciate you. Hey, just a little bit about me as we get started. A couple of weeks ago, my wife Katie and I, we actually celebrated our 21st wedding anniversary. And I know what you're thinking. You guys must have been married when you were babies. And if you're thinking that, you would be 100% correct. Like you were right in thinking that thought. We have 3, I guess, not so babies anymore. They've all started school here in the past couple of days down in the Indianapolis area. Our oldest is Ava. Our middle girl is Ella. Our youngest is our son, Aiden. And we've actually been on sabbatical this summer, just enjoying a little bit of time together. Hey, as we're kicking off and kind of getting to know each other just a little bit, let me start off by asking you a question. Have you ever noticed that you and I, we can tell ourselves some pretty crazy stories? Do you know what I'm talking about? You and I, we can see things that are happening in the real world, but the story we tell ourselves about what's actually happening, can we be honest, sometimes it can get a little crazy. Let me give you an example, kind of an embarrassing example from my own life, just as we're getting started here. My family and I, we've lived all over the country. At the time, we were living just a few minutes north of downtown Los Angeles, in the downtown area of Pasadena, California. Absolutely loved living there. One of the things I loved about living in the LA area is there's always something happening. Like there's always something on TV. In fact, most mornings, when I would wake up and I turn on the local news, there'd always be one of those high-speed car chases. You know what I'm talking about? And what I love about these high-speed car chases, there's always these guys who think that they are the ones. Like, nobody else has ever done it, but like their car, their way, like this is the one that's going to outrun the entire LA police force with all of the helicopters and all of the cars. And I love that moment. You guys know that moment, right? Where the sort of the bonehead thinking is, I can't outrun the police, at least my car can't. But if I stop the car, I pull it over, and I get out on my own 2 feet, surely then, at that moment, I can finally outrun the police. They do it every single time. And sure enough, with the helicopter falling overhead, they're running through some downtown, they're running through a neighborhood, and they always get tackled at the end. Our apartment complex actually set up against the freeway, so we would always see helicopters going overhead. Also, most mornings I would go for a run through the city of Pasadena. I'd run several miles out, and then I'd begin to make my way back. On this particular day, I was going for a run, and I heard the familiar hum of a helicopter overhead as I'm starting to make my way back. I was in like a college campus area, so there were these trees, and so I couldn't see, but I could hear the familiar hum of a helicopter. As I came out of the trees and I looked up, I'm back in the city. I was right, there was a helicopter, but what sort of freaked me out was there was a helicopter like directly overhead, and it felt like I could reach up and touch it. I mean, it was right there. And as I began running up Lake Avenue, this is one of the main thoroughfares there in the city of Pasadena, it began to follow me. I'm talking like I've got like a mile run up this road, and it's following me step for step. Somewhere along the way, I begin to realize I know exactly what has happened. They were chasing somebody on the freeway, and they've now chased them off of the freeway. The boneheads stashed the car. They're running on foot, and at any moment, like I'm going to be on TV. If I'm going to be on TV, like I'm going to have my fist drawn, like I'm going to be ready for the fight. I'm going to be the hero. I'm running up Lake Avenue with my fist. I make it to Lake in Colorado Boulevard. It's kind of the major thoroughfare in the area. And I look up, and there's now not one helicopter. There are actually 4 helicopters that are rotating directly over my head, like right there. I'm beginning to lose it. Like there's something about to go down. I turned down Colorado Boulevard, and one of those helicopters actually got out of the formation and began following me overhead. So now I'm seriously freaking out. In fact, what I've discovered is they are in fact looking for a bad guy. The problem is they think I'm the bad guy. Like this is not going to end well. At some point, like I'm thinking FBI, CIA, they're going to rappel out of the helicopters and take me out. I begin sprinting. Like it's no longer just like a fun leisurely walk, or run. It's now a sprint. And the irony is not lost on me as I tell the story that I've like at this moment become the bonehead that thinks they can outrun the police. Are you with me? Like I realize that's part of the story. As I finally make it back to the apartment complex, a 5th helicopter emerges on the other side of our apartment complex. It sits over my head for what seems like an eternity, and then it zooms off. I run up the steps, I run into our apartment complex, I lock the door behind me, and like my back's aching, like my blood's pumping, I can barely breathe. I notice my wife is sitting on the couch watching the TV. And I'm like, you are not gonna believe what's happening outside. She said, I know, I've been watching it on TV. And I'm thinking to myself, you've been watching this on TV? She said, yeah, there was a car wreck on the 210 freeway just on the other side of our apartment complex. Every news helicopter in the city is covering it. In fact, probably about the moment you were running up our steps, they just medevaced somebody off of the freeway and they're taking them to the hospital. And I can't breathe. I'm just standing there. I'm like, I know. That's exactly what I thought was happening outside. Like I didn't have any other thoughts. Like that is exactly what I thought was taking place outside. Have you ever noticed, you and I, we can tell ourselves some pretty crazy stories sometimes. Now, for me, it's like a funny story that I get to tell and laugh at myself, but the reality is, like all the time in real life, when real things are happening to us, you and I, we can often tell ourselves some really crazy stories. You and I can tell ourselves some pretty crazy stories. Something very real has taken place, but the story we tell ourselves, it's often not true. In fact, back in 2005, the National Science Foundation, they conducted a study on our thinking. And what they found is that you and I, we have some 60,000 thoughts in a day. If you ever get to the end of the day and you're just exhausted, like now you know why. Your brain has been going in overdrive all day long. But what they also discovered is perhaps even more surprising. You and I, with those 60,000 thoughts, 80% of those thoughts are actually negative. You do the math, that's 48,000 negative thoughts in a day. So you and I are not only telling ourselves often a false narrative, we're also telling ourselves a negative narrative. Now, and this is critically important to understand. When you and I are hurting, we actually compound the negative thinking. When you and I have some level of hurt in our lives, we compound that negative and false thinking, and we can end up telling ourselves some pretty crazy stories. Now, this is important because all of us have some level of hurt in our lives. Maybe for you, it's relational hurt. Maybe for somebody else, it's hurt from your past that hasn't quite healed. Maybe for you, your hurt is actually some kind of fear or anxiety about the future. All of us have some level of hurt, but the question I want to invite us to ask ourselves today is simply this: what should we do with our hurt? What should we do with our hurt? Now, I realize that's a really simple question, but how we answer that question is critically important. Since you and I all have hurt, and since hurt wildly distorts our view of reality, it's really important how we answer that question. What should we do when we hurt? We have all this negative and false thinking, not only about ourselves, not only about others, not only about the world around us, but perhaps the most dangerous distortion when we're hurting is how we think about God. Or moreover, how we think God feels about us in the midst of our hurt. When we're hurting, we often tell ourselves some pretty crazy stories about God. We think God is mad at us. We think God is aloof. He's apathetic. You might even think the reason you're going through that hurt is because God is frustrated with you. God is angry with you. And so he's been bringing that hurt into your life to punish you. We can tell ourselves some pretty crazy stories. So often when we're hurting, we believe a wild story, and the wild story causes us to run away from God rather than to run to God. What should we do when we hurt? I want us to slow down and look at this today. I wonder if the hurt has caused us to believe a crazy story or the wrong things about God. Like, what if we've been looking at our hurt wrong all this time? In fact, look with me at what the scriptures say. There's a promise that's true of God when we're hurting. It says this: the Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. When you and I hurt, we typically want to do everything we can to relieve the pain, to get out of the hurt, to get away from it. And yet the psalmist says when you hurt, it's actually an opportunity to get to experience more of God's presence and to see more of God's power in your life. Now, you see this all the time around you. You can see a parent of a child of any age, and when that child is hurting, they want to come close. And they want to do whatever they can to be a part of resolving that problem, that hurt. And this is exactly how God will feel about us. Now, the crazy story we often believe when we're hurting is that God is either absent or God is causing the pain. Yet the scriptures tell us so much about God. He's near to the brokenhearted. He saves those that are crushed in spirit. So often we think that God is causing or absent in the pain, but what if God's love and power are actually most fully expressed in the midst of our deepest hurt? What should we do when we hurt? What if there was a way to really know who God is and how God is moving in the midst of our hurt? The big idea I want to invite us to think about today is simply this: when your hurt draws you closer to God, rather than causing you to run away from God, which is what we so often do, when your hurt causes you to draw closer to God, it's there that you get to experience his presence and to see his power. You get to experience his presence and see his power in ways that you previously haven't. To do this, I want to look at two women in the midst of their deepest hurt and grief. I want you to see how they respond differently. They might represent you. And moreover, I want us to look at Jesus in the midst of their hurt. If you have a Bible, you're welcome to turn to John chapter 11. Of course, we'll have the scriptures up here on the screen as well. We're going to look at John chapter 11. It's going to help us walk out this truth that when your hurt draws you closer to God, it's there that you get to experience his presence and to see his power. It says this in John chapter 11, verse 1. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters, verse 3, sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." And when he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death." I want to pause for a moment. I think this is important. Jesus stops at the beginning of the story and he says, "This sickness will not end in death." But if you speed up the story a little bit, Lazarus does die. I think it's an important note that Jesus is putting here at the beginning. This sickness will not end in death, but this story will go through death. I think it's important for us to note that because so often in our lives, what we need to realize is when we turn to Jesus in the midst of our hurt, our story will not end in hurt. It will not end in pain, but quite often the goodness of God will go through some hurt and it will go through some pain. Jesus says this sickness will not end in death. He goes on, "No, it is for God's glory so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus is saying, no, this is being allowed so that God can be more fully glorified. More specifically, so that God's Son, he's referring to himself, so that God's Son can be more fully put on display. I want you to watch how we learn more about Jesus as we walk throughout this story. What Jesus says is going to be true. Verse 5. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. I love how John, the writer, doubles down on this. Jesus deeply loves this family. Now, if Jesus deeply loves this family and they're hurting, Lazarus is sick, we think we know exactly what Jesus is going to do. If he loves them, surely he's going to swoop in and save the day. He's going to get up immediately. He's going to run there. He's not going to stop till he gets there, and he's going to heal him. That's what he would do, after all, if he deeply loves them. And yet, verse 6. So, it's the cause and effect. Because he loves them, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Like, raise your hand if that makes any sense. He loves them, so he stays 2 more days. He knows these sisters whom he loves and this brother whom he loves. They're in pain, they're hurting, and yet he stays where he is 2 more days. And in so doing, we are learning a very important biblical truth. Because God loves, sometimes he waits. We assume, right, the crazy story we tell ourselves is if God loves me, he will do what I ask when I ask for it. And if he doesn't, right, he must be holding out on me in some way. Yet Jesus is showing us, no, because he loves, sometimes he waits. There's a bigger story at play. We often think the crazy story we tell ourselves is if he doesn't move, he must be holding out on us. He must be denying me in some way. And I pray tonight, perhaps you're in the middle of some hurt. And my prayer for you tonight is that you would hear this, that God's delay does not mean God's denial. God's delay does not mean God's denial. Now maybe you're thinking, yeah, but I've prayed and it's not changing. Like, when is my breakthrough going to come about? I've been singing or praying in faith. Like, when is my miracle going to come through? And I pray that you'll hear today, God's delay does not mean God's denial. Jesus has already told them, no, this is for God's glory. See, the crazy story we often tell ourselves is that the presence of hardship must mean the absence of love. But what if the presence of the hardship is actually the opportunity for God to express more of his love? What was the promise? He's near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. Going on in the story in verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. So Jesus stays, and by the time he finally reaches Bethany, Lazarus is dead and in the tomb for 4 days. And I wonder if we can just pause for a moment and place ourselves in the shoes of the sisters? My guess is we can, because we've all had times we've prayed and we felt like God was delaying, or moreover, that God was denying us something that we've been praying for. Jesus, we called for you. Where were you? Verse 20. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But catch this, but Mary stayed at home. I kind of like that they're just like us, right? Like Martha's like, I'm going out to Jesus. Mary's like, I'm not ready to talk to him yet. I'll talk to Jesus when I'm ready, and I'm not ready. Verse 21. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, eventually Martha goes back to Mary and she says, hey, Jesus he's been asking about you. And she'll come to Jesus. I think it's just an important note that Jesus isn't going to go and bang on the door and say, no, we're going to talk when I say we're going to talk. No. He stays where he is. He waits for us to come to him. Verse 32, when Mary, so she gets up and comes, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, this is going to sound familiar, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. What's going on? They've been sitting in the house for 4 days, weeping and grieving, and they've been repeating this same crazy story. If Jesus had been here, this wouldn't have happened. And yet they did sin for Jesus. He knows about it, and because he loved them, he waited. Jesus has been in control of this situation from the beginning. And yet, watch this. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. Now think about this. Think about what we already know in the story. Jesus has already said that this will not end in death. No, this is for God's glory. This is so that the Son of God can be more fully put on display. Jesus knows how this story is going to end, and yet in this moment, he's fully present with them, and he's weeping. Why? Well, why is Jesus weeping when he already knows the end of the story? It's a really simple answer, because he loves them. He loves them deeply, and they're hurting, so he hurts. Why is that important to know? Who is Jesus? He is both fully man and fully God. And so when Jesus comes alongside of them in the midst of their hurt and their grief and weeps, what he's showing them and now what he's showing us is that when you and I hurt, that God comes alongside of us and he hurts with us. He is not absent in our pain. He's right there beside it. He's beside us. He's near to the brokenhearted. He saves the crushed in spirit. When you're weeping, now you know what God's feeling up in heaven. When you're hurting, he comes near and he walks beside you. The crazy story we often tell ourselves is that if God hasn't moved in the way that I expected him to, God must be apathetic to my pain. But I pray you'll hear this today. God's seeming absence does not equal apathy. God's seeming absence does not equal apathy. In fact, far from it. Now, we all want God's glory to shine through our lives as followers of Jesus. And yet, can we be honest? We rarely see it that way while we're hurting. And yet, nothing has changed for Lazarus as yet in the story. Nothing. And yet, Jesus has already been glorified to some measure in the story because you and I already know more about him than when we began the passage. What Jesus promised would happen is happening. What does this teach us about what you and I should do when we hurt? If you're taking notes, I want to invite you just to write down a couple of quick things. What should we do when we hurt? The first one is simply this: don't let your hurt hold you back from running to Jesus. We saw this with his sisters, right? Martha runs straight away to Jesus. Mary's like, I'm not ready yet. Don't let your hurt tell you a crazy story and hold you back. No. Run to Jesus, because it's in those moments, in those seasons, where you get to experience his presence and you get to see his power. Now, I think it's fascinating. If you go and read the story in greater depth in John chapter 11, there's two different responses to the tears of Jesus. One group of people, they say, look at Jesus weeping with them. He really loved them. But there's another group of people that they say, yeah, but if he loved them, why didn't he do something? And if you and I are being honest, like, don't we kind of have seasons like that? Jesus, I prayed, and you stayed where you were 2 more days. Jesus, I prayed, and you allowed the hurt to go on. I've seen you do more in other people's lives. Why not me? Jesus, I've prayed. When are you going to help? I've prayed. When are you going to heal? I've prayed. When are you going to change the situation? And I want to challenge you today. Don't let your hurt hold you back from running to Jesus. Here's the second thing. Let the hurt remind you that God is close and moving in your life. That's the promise in the scripture, that he's near to the brokenhearted and he saves those that are crushed in spirit. It's a promise. This is who he is. This is what he does. Don't let the hurt hold you back. No, let the hurt become a trigger. If I'm hurting, now I know who God is and what he's doing in my life. Even if I don't see it, even if I don't feel it, this is who he is. This is what he's doing in my life. In fact, watch this. Watch what Jesus is going to do for them after he waited. Verse 38, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance, and he said, take away the stone. Jesus comes to their place of deepest hurt. And the truth is, Jesus desires to come to the place of your deepest hurt as well. Now, I think it's interesting. Jesus is about to do something that's never been done before, merely by speaking the words. And yet Jesus tells them, take away the stone. What's my point? If Jesus wanted to move the stone himself, he could have. He didn't need their help. He could have spoken the words and it would have rolled away. He could have spoken the words and the large stone would have turned to gravel. But he tells them to take away the stone because it's symbolizing that they've got to remove the stone and invite him into the place of their deepest hurt. And the same is true for you and me. If you're hurting today, Jesus says to you, take away the stone. Invite me into that place of deepest hurt. That place that feels 4 days dead. That dream that you think there's no way that it could be resurrected. That relationship that is just so broken. Whatever it might be for you, that place of deepest hurt, Jesus says, take away the stone and invite me there. He's near to the brokenhearted. He saves the crushed in spirit. In fact, watch this in verse 43. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice. I love that the author tells us it was a loud voice. Lazarus, come out! Why do I love that it's in a loud voice? Because John is telling us that Jesus is far from apathetic. He's been waiting for the moment where he can move in their life. He was just waiting on them to bring them to the place of their deepest hurt. Jesus wants to meet you as your place of deepest hurt. He wants to invite you to take away the stone in that area that feels 4 days dead. And what I love, Jesus says, Lazarus, come out. And in response to the voice of Jesus, the voice of Jesus has power. In response to the voice of Jesus, this man that had been dead for 4 days, he'd been dead for 4 days. His blood starts pumping. His lungs start breathing air. His bones and his ligaments and his tendons, they begin to move. Verse 44, and the dead man came out. Now, perhaps some of you in here, you've read the Bible a couple times and that sentence just sort of washes over you. A man who had been dead for 4 days walks out of a tomb in response to the voice of Jesus. His hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." When your hurt draws you closer to God, you get to experience his presence, just like we've seen with Mary and Martha, and you get to see his power in his timing and in his way, with what he wants to show you in the process. The voice of Jesus is just as close to you as it was to them. And just like with the sisters, your grave is not beyond God's grasp. I don't know what your hurt is. I don't know what feels 4 days dead, but my prayer for you is that you would believe that truth tonight. That your grave is not beyond God's grasp. All of us have a Lazarus prayer, a dream, a relationship, a brokenness. And I want to invite you today, take away the stone, open that place to Jesus, because to you, he wants to display his presence. He wants to display his power. Why? Why was Jesus delayed? Why was Jesus seemingly absent? Because he loved them. If he comes when the sisters want him to, if he performs the miracle that they want him to, they never get to see any of this. At this point in the ministry of Jesus, they know he can heal. They don't know that he can raise the dead. And because God stuck to his own plan instead of being moved by their prayers in that moment, their brother actually gets to be the foreshadowing of the greatest miracle ever when Jesus himself walks out of the grave by his own power. They only get to see this because God was seemingly delayed, because he was seemingly absent. God's delay in your life is not a denial of your prayers. God's seeming absence is not apathy. We can tell ourselves some pretty crazy stories, especially when we're hurting. We might think that God's mad at me. God's not listening to me. God's not powerful enough to move in my life, or he doesn't care enough to move in my life. But what if the presence of the hardship isn't the absence of God's love? What if the presence of the hardship is actually an opportunity for God to express to you more of his love? An opportunity where he wants to display himself more fully in your life and through your life. He's near to the brokenhearted. He saves the crushed in spirit. We see it with Martha and Mary. They don't get the miracle that they first request. Instead, they get something better, and it's a dramatic reminder to you and to me. What do we do? What do we do when we hurt? In the midst of our very own Lazarus prayer that feels 4 days dead in the tomb, what do we do? When hurt draws us closer to God, it's there that we get to experience his presence and to see his power. Now, it's fascinating if you read the end of the story. After Jesus brings a man back from the dead that's been dead for 4 days, there are two responses to Jesus. Now, you and I might think there's only one response, right? I just saw a man bring another man back from the dead. I'm going to place my faith in him and follow after this man named Jesus. And some do that. And yet there's another group of people, and they don't know what to do. In fact, it says that their very first thing they do is they run to the religious leaders and they say, "We don't know what to do with this Jesus. What do we do?" And I actually think that's a great question for you and I to close with today. What do we do with this Jesus? What do we do with this Jesus that invites us to bring our hurt to him, to bring him to that deepest hurt in our lives and remove the stone so he can come in and perform his healing work in his time and in his way? What do we do with this Jesus when your hurt draws you closer to God? It's there you get to experience his presence and to see his power. Maybe for you today, it's your opportunity to cross the line of faith and to say that this Jesus, he's going to become my Lord and my Savior.
I hope that this has been a meaningful experience for you, even online. And I want you to know that every time that we get together, both online and in person, we include a time of communion. This is a moment for people who follow Jesus to look back on life and remember with gratitude all the amazing things that God has done, our need for God right now, and to look forward with hope, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. So now is the time to get some food and drink to represent Jesus' body and his blood that was broken and poured out for each and every one of us. And during that time, we're going to reflect together. If you don't follow Jesus, that's totally okay. I'm glad that you're checking out this video. Go ahead and use this time to reflect on what you've heard so far. And with that, let's focus on the love of Jesus together. Before you turn off this video, go ahead and hit the like, subscribe, and share button. And I want you to know that this video, this isn't the church, you are. So this week, I hope that you go and make a difference, that you go and be the church.